Ele está falando em português, desliga aí. In the last year, renowned scientists have been here, and how democracies die, how democracies reach an end, and the dawn of democracy, where you have tyranny, the people against democracy. Certainly, science is also going through problems, and political sciences sometimes also face issues and differences and become exaggerated. However, it is worthwhile saying that liberal democracy, Western democracy, is under pressure in many countries. Traditional environments are dissolving, political alliances are weakening. The populist policies are gaining followers. Democracy is being defamed, and digital communication is giving voice to many citizens for the first time. And that certainly is positive on one hand. But digital communication also allows for new ways of manipulation of public opinion. We have already discussed different sides and faces of this new liberal democracy and the Democracy Forum. We've had voices that were so relevant, such as the former president of the Chamber of Deputies, Rodrigo Maia, and Katarina Bayer from the European Union, the president of the Constitutional Court, Andreas Totzler. And it's an honor to have here as speakers two ministers who occupied key positions in their governments. Tarso Genro was Minister of Justice, Education, and Institutional Relations, and also Governor of the state of Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil.
And he has very important resources for the debate on democracy. And he is engaged in this new more democratic Europe. To me, it is a pleasure to welcome Professor Suzanne Mettler. She makes research on political development and democracy, and with our forum, Democracy in Brazil and Europe, we want to learn about democracy, rule of law, and things that drive our countries. In 2020, we had over 3,000 participants in our forums, and we are sure that today we will also attract great interest and attention. Yes, good morning. Today, I am Michael Westland. I am responsible for organizing the Democratic Forum Brazil Europe on behalf of the German Embassy in Brasilia, Brazil. My co-moderator is Marco Rudiger, a great expert in Brazilian politics. And first of all, I will describe the event. All our three speakers will have 20 minutes each to discuss the polarization in their respective regions, and they will give us suggestions of what to do to avoid this. We will begin with Joschka Fischer. He was the Foreign Relations Minister until 1995, and he is a great thinker of democracy in Germany. He made a great speech that was mentioned all over the world, and he is considered somebody who fought for democracy around the world. After him, we have Mr. Tarso Genro, 3 times minister during Lula administration. He was the Minister of Justice, the Chief Justice, and he was also governor of the state of Rio Grande do Sul. And finally, Professor Suzanne Mettler, who works as a historian. She compares different periods in the history of the United States. Our public can type questions in the chat box during the event. Simply type your question, and our Professor Rudiger and myself will forward the questions to our speakers. So let us begin with Mr. Fischer. You have the floor. Thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to send my greetings from Berlin.
Die wir heute diskutieren wollen, das ist der Zustand und die Perspektive der Demokratie an 3 höchst unterschiedlichen Ländern oder Regionen. Das eine, über die ich zu sprechen, ist Europa, das andere Brasilien und die USA. Da liegt schon mal ein enormer Unterschied, weil Europa ist kein Land. Europa ist eben eine homogene Gemeinschaft, die eine Sprache spricht. In der EU werden viele Sprachen gesprochen und es gibt kaum ein delikateres Problem als das Sprachenproblem, weil daran macht sich Geschichte fest, daran macht sich auch die Identität vor allen Dingen der kleineren Nationen fest, aber auch der großen. Das heißt, die Sprachenfrage zeigt die Schwierigkeit einer europäischen Demokratie und eine gewisse Ironie liegt darin, es hat sich in der EU einfach durch die praktischen Erfordernisse eingebürgert, dass alle sprechen jetzt Englisch, nachdem die Engländer gegangen sind.
In the Brazilian Union, it is the issue of languages, because languages have to do with history, and that has to do with the identity of small and large nations. It's all an issue of how an European democracy is difficult. And the difficulty is that in European Union, it became necessary to have everyone speak English after they left. So the language is left because it's somehow standardized everything in Brussels, and now the United Kingdom has left. So if we compare Europe to these democracies in Brazil and the US, we need to think that European Union is not a country. It is made up of several member states, and that is the major difficulty. On the other hand, it would not have worked. We have major contradictions in European Union. If we think that it was formed after the Second World War with the purpose of avoiding armed conflict between Germany and France. That is when you had the beginning of 2 world wars. So they no longer wanted to have that. And the decision was to unify the strategic potentials of both countries, steel and coal at the time. So the focus was to create this friendship between Germany and France because the historical roots are similar. Germans and French began their history at the same time, 800, 900 after Christ. And they have so many issues in common. But whenever you talk about the different children in the same family, you see there aren't so many differences. They are offsprings of the same genetics, the same parents, and they have commonalities. And that generated, however, great potential for conflicts, which led to the two world wars. And the answer for that was European Union. But it was a good solution. Having the meeting of small and large countries with a common interest in addition to different interests, but democracy was left behind. Democracy originally was not an European issue because the parliament was not sovereign. On the other hand, the democratization of European Union is a huge success. And in Brussels, there's a parliament, which is an institution where the legal acts are okay and need to be ratified. And if you look at how the parliament members from 26 different nations with their different languages and how they reach agreements, that's quite an impressive result. And now, in the 21st century, we are walking towards the digital world, and the parliament has played a very important role in that. When we talk about democracies, with all the issues we have and problems like Hungary and Poland, we've had nationalist developments in the member states, which are far from being positive. It's not acceptable. On the other hand, we need to understand that after 1989, the European Union reached a significant integration, not only with the reunification of Germany, it was a reunification of the whole of Europe. Eastern Europe brought a new perspective. They had faced different situations over the last 5 decades. So we need to be patient. It all takes time. And there is no possibility that we have a nationalist power or government challenging the different powers. And that taking place and being centralized and acting from Brussels. No, the European Union has limited resources, but it is very important, on the other hand, because in these attempts, it acts as a brake to all of these movements. And the financial resources of the European Union are very important too for democratic movements. So it acts as a balancing force between national governments and Brussels. And when I say Brussels, I mean the European Parliament and the Commission that plays this very important role. And this balance is not found in the US, nor do we have it in Brazil, because we are an association of countries and not a country. So the democratic issues in Poland and Hungary will be overcome. It will take some time. And it wouldn't be prudent to demand something which is not considered. It would not be prudent also to remove them from the European Union. We need to go through these conflicts. We need to do that in the context and framework of democracy. It has not worked perfectly until now, but it has worked. So the European Union has gone through different crises. It's been resolving things. It's been reaching a level of integration. European Union is a project. And the European democracy, it's not that it's trying to reach a specific strategy. It is a project full of crises that have been overcome, faced and overcome. And now the shock from Donald Trump had massive effect upon the European Union. It became clear that we Europeans will need to take care of ourselves. We can't rely upon the US. To Brazilians, it may sound strange, but this is a very important message to Europeans.
And there were many situations and crises in Europe. And to the point that we could no longer count with the European Union. Minister Salvini from Italy was totally against the union, attacked it greatly, but there was no result. So ultimately, you criticize the euro, you try to undermine democracy in Europe, but in the end, most European citizens know that we cannot survive without the European Union. No discussion about that, because the consequences would be terrible. So in this sense, I am quite optimistic. Democracy in Europe will continue to advance in spite of external pressure and threats, which also have a role. And now, amidst this horrible pandemic, for the first time, we were finally able to have a European recovery program, which was unprecedented. It's for the first time it is developed in this manner. And if it is successful, maybe the Southern Europe compared to Northern Europe will always be lagging behind in terms of unemployment, industrial development, social security. And if this recovery program, the 10 billion euros, are actually well invested, not in things that already exist, but in new things, new technologies, new jobs, more sustainability, then it will most probably provide more development to Europe's southern countries. So the recovery program, which for the first time enables the European Commission to have debts, this is unedited debts that are guaranteed by the member states. So this recovery program will be a very important hallmark to advance democracy in Europe. Europeans are aware that they need to do something. We have no other way out. This is the lesson that we had to learn from Donald Trump. But it is also interesting for our relations that the Latin American and European countries continue to cooperate in the areas of education, culture, politics, and policies, and economy. We have to advance further. There are many common interests, and based on them, we can do a lot. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Fischer. I will now give the floor immediately to Minister Tarso Genro, so that we can have all three presentations. So, Mr. Genro, you have the floor. I would like to thank you, Mr. Westland. My respectful greetings to the ambassador and also to Minister Joschka Fischer, this historical and great character in German and global politics. And my respects to Professor Suzanne Mettler, who will follow me. I must also greet my dear friend Marco Aurelio Rudiger, who worked with me in all the ministries when I was a minister, and also in the government of the state of Rio Grande do Sul, always through the Getúlio Vargas Foundation, FGV, with our wonderful public management programs. I believe that the starting point proposed by Mr. Zosker is crucial. It starts with liberal democracy, which is suffering a global crisis today, which will only be corrected with more democracy and never with less democracy. This is a debate that is present in all Latin American countries. The corrections that have been made to the effectiveness of fundamental rights are corrections that come from a perspective of destruction of democracy, destruction of the formal structures of political representation, and also of the creation of a parallel order, constitutional order. This is very important to understand, and I make the suggestion to see it this way, because it is there that we will see the rise of solutions. The major crisis that democracy suffered in the last century, when revolutionary changes occurred, both politically, economically, socialist reprogramming, the popular social democrats, the reasons for democratic illuminism and enlightenment that comes from other times, and the perversions in this very process came up with a very high intensity and with a very strong confrontation between extremes. In the Weimar Republic in Germany, with the rise of fascism, what determined the appearance of the extreme rightist government to bring down the formal democratic order that was being developed since the beginning of the century in very important countries of Europe occurred because of a radical political confrontation between these extremes. And this is now occurring, but in a different manner. And how we face this other or this new form will indicate us the possible path for democratic resistance and resiliency, and the major policies that countries like ours, which have continental influence, as Mr. Fischer mentioned very properly, Europe is not one country. It is a group of countries that are articulated around democracy, and which is nowadays dominant. It is hegemonic in Europe. I remember when we discussed in Brazil the effectiveness of our 1988 Constitution. It has an extraordinary preamble, and all the interpretations of the rules that come after the preamble should be based on that. Of course, a constitution is always a duty to be, a duty that in 1988 established tasks that were quite utopic because of the historical period when this formal democracy was established here in the country. But we do have some characteristics since then. For example, sovereign foreign relations and relations of cooperative interdependency. These relations have not changed greatly. They developed in an evolutionary manner, enabling Brazil in certain periods, such as, for example, during Fernando Henrique's government, and even more strongly during Lula administration, would present themselves to the world as a country that was a peer, that had a global voice, and that did not fantasize its positions with utopic proposals that were undefined. But in this period, we also had a moment of decadence, and this decadence is reaching extremes here in Brazil, because the voice that should come from the Constitution no longer comes from the formal institutions or the rules. It comes rather from a parallel system of power that is alienated from the Constitution. It is therefore parallel to the Constitution, where those who construe the Constitution in permanent shock with the Supreme Court is a legal formula that was started in major debates in Germany last century of those who are the guardians of the Constitution, the Supreme Court. Formally in Brazil, the Supreme Court is the guardian of the Constitution, but the voice commanding the law in Brazil has been the voice of the leader or the Führer. And this shock that we are perceiving here in Brazil has been bringing down the democratic liberal project of the rule of law. Therefore, this was founded in Brazil as the Weimar Constitution was, which was later restructured after World War II and brought about democracy in Germany. What are the questions that derive from this relationship of cooperation, which can bring back and restore the respect to the different constitutions in a new international order? First of all communication between our countries about the environment. This is not a matter of social class. It is not a matter of geopolitics of one country or another, and it is not related to the survival of organizational ideas from society, but it is rather the fate of society itself. So countries that are sovereign and that have political dignity and that believe that they want more democracy to save the representative liberal structure of representative liberal democracy, they need to understand the environmental issue and sustainability. And I believe that President Biden's victory in the US is an extraordinary political fact. The second point, which seems important to me and which also reflects in the internal order of our respective countries or group of countries in Europe, are the international exchanges in science, technology, economy, with reciprocal conveniency. Because the asymmetry of international relations that reflect in finance, in technology, and in the economy generate internal effects that are perverse if they are not well established. And I believe that President Bolsonaro in Brazil is a product of this asymmetry. All his demagoguery and his authoritarian nationalism attacks who? Who does he face? Who does he attack? Him and his defenders. They attack international economic relations, international cultural relations, and the decadence of political globalism. And then they bring with them the low-income masses and the top classes also a denial of politics and of democracy, and an attack to globalization, which is not a globalization that has a perverse side. It is an attack to any relation of exchange and political relationship between different peoples of the world. Now, the point that unfortunately is no longer new to us is the virus, the pandemic, which produces in our country more poverty, more exclusion, more violence, and a greater rule of the territory by militias that are incentivized by the government. I'm sure that Mr. Fischer is thinking about an experience, and the ambassador also, about experiences that they experienced in Germany in the last century. Unfortunately, all the enlightened thoughts that were in the German culture were brought down by that. Now, the aspect of pandemic and poverty and exclusion is not something that cannot be corrected easily. It can be corrected. And if it is not corrected according to democratic parameters, it will be solved in a more brutal fashion, which happened in moments of structural imbalance in the political and human relationships, as well as the integrative relationships between nations, which is war. Fortunately, right now, the war has taken a step back with the defeat of President Trump in the US. It has a very important meaning to Brazil that Trump was defeated in the US. Brazil was supported in a relationship of ideological servitude, as well as political and economic servitude towards the US, which would lead us to an isolation from where it would be very hard to return to a more mutual, respectful moment without violence. And with that, we reopened our country's democratic possibility, and we can establish relations that I call interdependence with sovereignty and with solidarity at the global level. And the European Union has a key role in this equation. At least part of the left wing that I am a part of, we were very sad and very historically tired and stressed to see the Brexit occurring, UK leaving the European Union. I believe they will return, and it will be better, both for the UK and for the European Union, as well as for humankind. So please forgive me if I am expressing a negative tone or a pessimistic tone, but I was a state governor in a country where the president is supposed to be for all of the people, but is ultimately a president of what is remaining of the Brazilian population after his horrible acts against social distancing, against science, and embracing this medieval behavior that can take us to another dark age. I'm sure that science and good politics will return. At least this is what we intend to see again. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dann möchte ich gleich überleiten zu Professor Mettler von der Cornell University.
Okay, hello everyone. I'm so happy to be with you, and thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this event.
I'd like to give the floor to.
So I am a professor of American politics in the United States, and for many years I've taught courses to introductory students on American politics, and I was teaching in 2015 and I was teaching for many years and finding it more and more challenging as the United States, as I had known it, was changing because political polarization was growing so much, as well as economic inequality. But then we got to 2015 and 2016, and Donald Trump became the political candidate and then won his party's nomination. And suddenly it was mind-bending to me to try to teach this course that I had taught for so long, because even things we had taken for granted, like the legitimacy of American elections and freedom of the press, were being questioned. And so it was very challenging. And it was at that time that I began to talk with other colleagues of mine, political scientists who study countries around the world and democracy in danger. And I felt that they understood better than I did how to think about this moment. They had a vocabulary and a framework for doing so. So a group of us began to learn from each other and to think about what makes democracy in danger. And it's out of that that I wrote a book, 4 Threats. I will pull up my slides at this point and share my screen with you. I wrote this book with Robert Lieberman, who is a professor of political science as well. And let me just tell you first that on January 6th of this year, we were both watching in horror as hundreds of Trump supporters stormed the US Capitol, trying to interfere with the final step in certifying the results of the 2020 presidential election. And they desecrated this sanctuary of American democracy with their Confederate flags and Nazi symbols, and by trying to overturn the will of the voters with brute force. 6 people died, and many police officers were badly wounded, and it could have been much worse. Most shocking of all, the insurrection was incited by the president himself, who had spent the previous months denying his loss in the presidential election, despite all evidence to the contrary. Now, to their credit, members of Congress reconvened that evening, and they ultimately confirmed the election results. But 139 members of the House Republican caucus, the majority, plus several Republican senators, refused to recognize the election results. And still to this day, many Republican citizens think that Biden was not legitimately elected. Now, when Robert Lieberman and I sent off our book for publication, which was about a year ago, after that, over the next many months leading up to the election and the months that followed it, damage to American democracy escalated. And so many events reminded us of occurrences in the American past that we had been studying. So I'm going to share my screen now with you. Hold on just one moment. Okay, so we wrote this book to think about whether American democracy had been in danger in the past, and what could we learn from applying these insights from scholars who study democracy in danger worldwide if we applied them to the American past. So in the decades following the Civil War, for those who had rights to participate, it was quite a vibrant time. And it included African-American men in the South who had gained voting rights and were participating at high rates in elections and running for office primarily as Republicans. And this is just, you know, in the decades following the demise of slavery and the end of the Civil War. Also, the People's Party emerged in 1892 out of the agrarian populist movement, and it began to run candidates quite successfully. But at that very juncture, democracy was thrown into crisis. And let's zoom into North Carolina in the 1890s. There, Republicans and populists noticed that if they joined forces and ran candidates on what was called a fusionist ballot, they could beat the Democrats, who were at that time in the South, the party run by white elites. So a very different party then than the Democratic Party in the United States today. And that's what they did. In 1896, these fusionists managed to elect Republicans as governor and to the majority of the state seats in the US House of Representatives and the state assembly. And Democrats' worst fears had come to pass, and they began to plot their way back to power. So they began to organize these militia that I'm showing you a photo of here. These are called the Red Shirts. And in 1898, they staged a coup d'etat in the city of Wilmington in the state of North Carolina. It was the state's largest urban area, and it was a success story at the time because African Americans were moving into the middle class, and there were elected officials who were Black, as were numerous public sector employees. There was a Black-owned newspaper called the Daily Record. It was the only one of its kind in the nation. So democracy seemed to be on the rise. But on the morning of November 10th, 1898, nearly 2,000 white men who belonged to paramilitary groups gathered at the city armory. They marched to the offices of the Daily Record, set the building on fire, and watched it burn, as this photo is showing. They dragged prominent people from their homes and took them to the train station, made them leave town. And before the day was out, the coup leaders had at gunpoint forced the resignation of the mayor and other elected officials and installed their own in their place. Now, this year, on January 6, 2021, the similarities were all too striking. Just like in 1898, there were armed white supremacists who were once again the most visible in the insurrection. Also, in both instances, it was political party leaders who had incited the violence and spread misinformation. And what occurred in both events was that these party leaders were unwilling to abide by the most fundamental principle of democracy, that when elections are held, someone will lose. And when you or your party loses, you have to accept the outcome and stand down or concede and communicate to your supporters that they must do the same. So the overarching question that we asked in this book, Four Threats, is American democracy in peril today? Now, many people would assume that despite everything that's happened in these last few years, that democracy has prevailed and we had a transfer of power in January, even if it was not a completely peaceful one. And many think that the United States is protected, that democracy is safe because of having the oldest constitution in the world with its system of checks and balances. And the United States is a wealthy country, and that's a factor that makes the loss of democracy seem unlikely. In addition, while the nation in the 1790s included institutions that repudiated democracy, most of all slavery, and it did not, I would argue, become a full democracy until the 1960s and 1970s when rights were extended to all citizens. Nonetheless, democracy has progressed over time and it has become more robust and inclusive. On the other hand, American democracy can be considered to be at risk of deteriorating or backsliding. As we've learned from those who study it in other nations, these days, we don't tend to see democracy taken at the barrel of a gun or canceled elections or the disbanding of a legislature. Rather, it tends to happen in more subtle ways. Typically, elections are still held, and yet democracy decays, such that a nation becomes a hybrid with some features of democracy, but others of authoritarianism. So in other words, we shouldn't be thinking of democracy having a switch that you turn on and off, but rather being on a continuum. And the question is whether at any point in time we're moving toward becoming more of a full democracy or backsliding in the direction of autocracy. So that is the task of this book. We examined 5 earlier periods in American history when people were concerned about democratic backsliding. And we observed the patterns that ensued, and then we analyzed the contemporary period in light of what we have learned. Now, by democracy, what we mean is a system of representative government with accountability to citizens. And there are 4 basic pillars that make this work: free and fair elections, the rule of law, the legitimacy of the political opposition, and the integrity of rights, meaning civil liberties, civil rights, and voting rights. And this, of course, all of these together in combination make a country a liberal democracy. And these 4 features give us indicators that we assess in the historical periods we examine to see whether democracy is expanding or retreating. We have learned from those who study democratic deterioration around the world that there are 4 threats that can make democracy vulnerable. And political polarization that we're focusing on in this panel today is, of course, one of those. And perhaps it's the most important. But it's also very dangerous when that combines with any of these other threats. One of them is conflict over membership and status, rising economic inequality, and executive aggrandizement. I'm going to go through each of these in turn now. This first one, political polarization, can lead to politics and society seeming like a contest of us versus them. So political scientists know that democracy works well when there are multiple groups and identities in a society and people have overlapping and cross-cutting affiliations. For example, you might associate with people with different political views than your own, whether it's in your workplace or your church or organizations that you belong to. What's problematic is when these differences increasingly align and people sort themselves out into 2 camps of us versus them. Then politics ceases to be a process involving negotiation and accommodation, and it becomes like mortal combat. And other citizens start to seem less like fellow citizens, but rather as enemies. And this can happen both, among the public and in institutions, legislatures as well. The second threat, what we call conflict over who belongs, is when there's real conflict over the boundaries of who's included in the political community. Democracy works well when people agree on who is a member and what their status is. If there's some unresolved formative rift in the nation's founding over who is included, it can reemerge as a source of trouble again and again, whether it's over race or ethnicity or gender or whatever. In the periods we examine, battles over race take center stage, especially those concerning those who are most overtly excluded in the founding of the United States, African Americans. The third threat is high and rising economic inequality. Now, when I first learned about this, I assumed it meant that democracy would be in danger if the 99% were going to rise up and have a revolution. But in fact, it's the opposite. What happens with high and rising economic inequality is that the wealthiest people, the most powerful and wealthy groups and individuals, try to defend the material gains that they have made because they are afraid that if the 99% gain power, they will lose them. And democracy is not their concern. They're willing to run roughshod over it in order to protect their interests. And finally, executive aggrandizement can endanger democracy. This means the enlargement of powers of the nation's top leader, and which can lead to the demise of checks and balances. In the United States, this is vested in the American presidency, which has been growing more power since the 1930s. And actually members of both parties, presidents of both parties have participated in growing the powers of the presidency. And that can make a nation more prone to tyranny. So all four of these threats have waxed and waned and combined in different ways in American history. And what we've really learned is that American democracy has in fact been very fragile time and again. In fact, you know, up until the last handful of years, it had really enjoyed over a half century of being very calm. And so I think we had been lulled into complacency of thinking democracy was very safe. But if you look further into the American past, what you find is that it has been in danger time and again. So let me chat for a few moments about this period of the 1790s. Political polarization had been growing for years, and each action by one camp provoked an even greater counter-reaction from the opponents. Then the president signed into law provisions that made it more difficult for immigrants to attain citizenship. In addition, the president signed a law that would allow for the prosecution of journalists who criticized his administration. Both were efforts to weaken the political opposition. This, to many Americans, would sound like it happened in the last few years. Maybe it was 2017, but in fact, this happened in 1798, when President John Adams had just signed into law what was called the Alien and Sedition Acts. Adams' emerging political party, the Federalists, defended this law as essential for national security. Or as one congressman at the time put it, there was no need to, quote, invite hordes of wild Irishmen, nor the turbulent and disorderly of all the world, to come here with a basic view to disrupt our tranquility, end quote. Indeed, no sooner was the ink dry on the American Constitution than Americans themselves became deeply polarized, and public officials led the way. Among them, leaders who just years earlier had spoken out against creating political parties, and they'd spoken out about how factions could be so dangerous. But the Washington administration quickly created its own media outlet, a newspaper called the Gazette of the United States. And then Thomas Jefferson created an opposing newspaper, the National Gazette, to give voice to the rising opposition, the Republicans. And a war of words commenced. And it was quite vitriolic. And that was just the opening chapter of this period, the 1790s. Ordinary Americans took sides as well. Federalists and Republicans often resided in different neighborhoods and attended different churches. And as hostilities grew, they each took on their own ways of demonstrating their patriotism. Here you see them on the right-hand side. They're burning an ambassador, John Jay, in effigy. This is the National Gazette on the left-hand side. So polarization grew very quickly, and political leaders had not developed this idea that you can have a legitimate political opposition, that groups can take on different approaches to governing and public policy and compete with each other through the political process. So instead, their conflicts took on the proportions of mortal combat because they thought the existence of the nation itself was at stake. And many Americans at the time who were watching worried that the nation wasn't going to survive the decade, and that monarchy would reassert itself or aristocracy would replace representative government. So the point is that early American democracy was really fragile. This artwork I'm showing here comes from what was called the Whiskey Rebellion, which occurred in the state of Pennsylvania at this time, as a new federal law that put a tax on whiskey was being resisted by those who produced whiskey. And here they have a federal tax collector. They're carrying him on a rail, which was a form of torture at the time. Things got so bad that the Washington administration feared civil war would break out. Here's President George Washington, our first president, who was leading troops into Western Pennsylvania to put down this insurrection. The only time an American president has ever done that in their role as commander-in-chief. And so, you know, the nation was really in a polarized state, and by the skin of its teeth managed to have a transfer of power in the election of 1800, but came very close to losing it. In the 1850s, the confluence of these first three threats that I've talked about led to the Civil War, very bloody Civil War. And then in the 1890s, the first three threats combined again, led to the events that I was mentioning at the beginning of my talk. I want to return to that now for a few moments. A few months after the coup in Wilmington, North Carolina that I was describing, the Democratic Party in that state took measures statewide to make their power permanent. They scaled back voting rights by establishing poll taxes and literacy tests. As one Democrat who was a state senator put it, he favored, quote, a good, square, honest law that will always give us a good Democratic majority, end quote. By the end of the 1890s, all four pillars of democracy had suffered harm. And the main result was the disenfranchisement of millions of Black men and some poor whites. And that lasted for 60 years. So it was backsliding with major consequences. And, in the process of all of that, civil liberties and civil rights were taken away from African Americans as well. And white Southern elites regained extra political power, not only to rule in their own states as autocrats, but also to exercise an outsized voice in national politics for the next half century. So it's worth thinking about, how did this happen? It was not inevitable. There were these three threats to democracy that coalesced, and political leaders took advantage of them in ways that led to severe backsliding. So the racism was plain to see. It was out in plain sight. And these leaders embraced white supremacy because it worked well as a political strategy to unify whites and to put down the political opposition. They stoked it as a means of stoking polarization. So it combined with polarization in a really dangerous way. Economic inequality was also present as well, although it was less visible, but it was also instrumental. Now, although much has changed, the politics of the 1890s reverberates in our own times. Then as now, we see these three threats having combined. And I must say that, after this attempted coup, essentially, on January 6, 2021, if you look at what's happening in the United States right now, it's also similar to what happened later in the 1890s, which is that the Republican Party being so angry that it was not able to prevail in the election and still denying the legitimacy of the election, is trying to shut down or to, restrict voting rights in ways that are particularly going to affect African Americans in many of these same Southern states. So it's remarkable, the parallels to this earlier period. I will not go through the other periods we study in the book, the 1930s and 1970s, but what these periods reveal is that American democracy has been more fragile than many Americans think. The United States has undergone numerous crises when democracy risked severe deterioration. We've had a tumultuous history, and the past half century until recent years was relatively serene by comparison. Over and over again, the nation risked instability, violence, and the demise of rights. All four characteristics of democracy were threatened repeatedly, and on occasion there was real backsliding with long enduring consequences. The four threats have waxed and waned throughout history and combined in different ways. High polarization in all three of these first periods was particularly dangerous and volatile when it combined with the other threats. And when the three combined, it led, to this severe backsliding. Yet the four threats do not by themselves determine what unfolds in politics. They do not operate according to a predictable equation or foreordain some particular outcome. Rather, political actors at any given time period can exert their will and make choices that will make the crucial difference. Now, today, in this period, for the first time ever, we have, in the United States, we're facing all four threats at once. So it's a very dangerous time. And we really need to heed that and protect democracy. I'll give just a few quick indicators of how democracy is in danger today. We've seen this rising political polarization in the US Congress. These graphs indicate how it's present in both chambers. It's been high and rising. It's also the case that polarization has been growing among ordinary citizens. This graph indicates how Democrats and Republicans among the public feel about the other party. And what you'll see looking over time is that people have increasingly negative views of the other party. And that is associated with treating the opponents more as enemies. It's also the case that racial attitudes are combining with political partisanship. And on the one hand, this means that one party, the Democratic Party, now contains more people who really believe more strongly in the ideals of democracy than I think has ever been present in a political party in the United States before, ever in history. And that party is really wanting to expand American democracy across lines of race and ethnicity and gender and income group. But the Republican Party, by contrast, has also shifted over the last couple of decades to including more people who think that status hierarchies in the United States need to be preserved or restored, or that we need to go back to those of the past. And this is also very problematic to have such polarized views between the two parties. Rising economic inequality it's also very high, and that's dangerous. I don't have a measure to show you of executive aggrandizement, but it's also been growing over time. So all of these threats long predated the rise of Donald Trump. I would say that he was a symptom of them, not a cause. But once he was president, he exacerbated them in ways that were really dangerous and caused some real harm. And now these threats have taken on a life of their own, and they are on course to persist for years. And we're likely to undergo many years of what can be called careening, where you have volatile party conflict that could produce backsliding. So the question for Americans has to be how to make the preservation and the restoration of democracy our first priority so that we can pass it on to future generations. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Ja, herzlichen Dank allen drei Sprechern. Und da wir so relativ wenig Zeit für die Diskussion haben, möchte ich einfach gleich anfangen. Ich würde die erste Frage
stellen. Thank you very much to all three of you. And since we are behind time, we will begin the questions. I will ask the first one, and it will be for Minister Fischer. Marine Le Pen, if she is elected president of France next year, how will the European Union survive with a supranational concept? You believe they might backslide? No, there will be no retrocession, no backslide. There will be a crisis that will threaten its existence. We need France in Europe as well as Germany. They are the strongest countries. We need more infrastructure, and therefore all of the European Union is based on the friendship between Germany and France. And this represents a crisis that threatens the whole world. So let us expect and hope that this does not happen. I was also worried about this last year because we had Trump and Brexit, and my nightmare would be the third point, Marine Le Pen. So if the European Union can survive such a three-pronged threat, I really doubt it. For the European Union, this would be an enormous existential threat.
Bom, eu vou fazer minha pergunta, eu vou fazer em português, minha língua
I will ask my question. Sorry to be speaking in Portuguese. My question is, first of all, for Minister Genro, but it can also be addressed to Professor Mettler, because our countries are in similar situations. Of course, this occurs more in Europe, but also very intensively in Brazil, as it has been happening in the USA, which is this extreme polarization in society, pointing out to ruptures that go against the constitutional state. So my question is basically, how can we build agendas in which the political centers will recover their dialogue to become a counterweight to the extremes, and how can this involve the new technologies, communication technologies especially, but also cross-cutting issues such as the environmental issue? How can it be used to dialogue and to overcome the problems and to recover democracy? How can polarized societies use these leverages to overcome this impasse of polarization? I believe that the corporate segments that are more robust in Brazil and more universally acknowledged as important for global economy, they need to stop this alliance with Bolsonaro. They maintain their alliance with him, although they are disappointed at him because of a political transaction. They bet that Bolsonaro would be capable of bringing about the necessary economic, labor, and security reforms that they desire for the country. Their agenda is extremely economicistic. I have an assessment of my own, which I believe that our entrepreneurial classes in Brazil do not have a vision towards the nation's fate in a more just, fair, and with less social inequalities. Since we use that classical expression of the bourgeoisie that integrated in the global world, they depend excessively on what goes on in international politics. And in international politics, these reforms are required and demanded so that they can happen. So I believe that the key for this alliance to discontinue, or at least to release part of the business community, is the kind of relationship and integration that the political elites in the country that are mainly connected to these businessmen will develop in this new world order that involves the European Union, the United States, Russia, and some smaller hubs. China evidently is one of the major ones too, in terms of this relationship. So these external impacts will be crucial for a rearrangement of Brazil. And why? Simply because Brazil does not dispose of the necessary resources to implement any social integration policy that are exactly concentrated on the top classes, on these top entrepreneurial and business classes. So the big relationship that can happen, and the big question is, how will we be integrated in the new global order? And what will be the reflections, the reflexes that this will bring to the political relations in Brazil? Apart from that, I believe it will be very difficult to manage to have a broader alliance, which is more of a central one, tending to the left, and therefore stabilizing the central left wing in Brazil. But do not confuse central left wing in Brazil to that of the other countries. Our central left wing has its special peculiarities, which do not necessarily follow a vertical society. There are very strange oligarchic political relations in Brazil that have a dramatic impact on the development of any government program. But these, to me, would be two elements that would help Brazil get rid of this government that is bringing us closer and closer to the cliff.
I would be happy to weigh in now myself about what can reduce polarization in the United States. What we know as political scientists is that once polarization grows, it's very hard to reverse it because it takes on a life of its own, and more gets swept up in its path. And that's very challenging. But that said, I am actually feeling more hopeful right now. I think that President Joe Biden is actually proceeding just the way he should to try to reduce polarization. And he's doing that by introducing very bold proposals, kind of like along the scale of what Franklin D. Roosevelt suggested in the 1930s in the New Deal, for big plans for rebuilding the nation's infrastructure, and for expanding education, for universal pre-kindergarten for young children, and for free 2 years of college, which we don't have in the United States, for all Americans, and for help for families with childcare, paid sick leave. The United States is, one of the only countries in the world that doesn't have paid sick leave. We're, very behind in all of these kinds of social provisions. I think it will be challenging to enact these things because of polarization in Congress. But even if any of them are adopted, it is going to be helpful because it will reduce inequality in the United States somewhat, and it will show people what government can do for them. And I think that, a lot of the support for Donald Trump was on the part of people who were fed up, who really had come to have such low confidence in government that they were taken in by someone who was a demagogue with his nationalism and authoritarian kind of ethos. They were taken in by that. But if people can be reminded that government can actually do things that are helpful to them and to their families, I think that will be the most hopeful thing for reducing polarization. Unfortunately, the example that was given in the question about cross-cutting policy issues like the environment, that doesn't work in the United States. It would have worked 30 years ago. It was the case that the Republican president like George H.W. Bush was an environmentalist. The Republican Party was in as recently as 1990. But as polarization has grown, so many policy issues have become polarized between the parties. And the Republican Party very staunchly does not want to deal with climate change while the Democratic Party does. And the same is true around issues like gun control and other things that you might assume are cross-cutting. Because in fact, a majority of Americans do want action on these issues, but party leaders in the Republican Party do not. So that's very difficult, and it's hard to find common ground in Congress. But I think that Biden is doing his level best to find a way forward.
Dann hätte ich noch eine weitere Publikumsfrage an Minister Fischer. Ihre Partei scheint bei den Wahlen im Herbst erstmals die Chance zu haben, die Kanzlerin zu stellen und vielleicht ein linkes
Your country, your party in the next elections? Do you think that there will be more polarization? Germany has a great task of modernizing itself from now on.
The risk is polarization also. I'm not going to talk about AFT, but AFD represents these forces of which you're talking about here in Brazil. It's populism, retrograde, nationalism, and that is a reality we are living today. But this modernization will only be possible if you are ready to take these risks. With this issue of sustainability, climate protection, but also social justice, these are all aspects that are part of the whole, and we need to make effort to face it. Southern Europe is living and experiencing a good moment with this recovery program. We're talking about major values, major figures. If that is invested in the modernization of economies, that will have a good effect. And the same is valid for other parts of Europe. So, yeah, it is going to be an interesting moment. If Germans are ready to do that, I believe this is what we will have to do over the next elections. And well, I'm very optimistic. But an important thing in democratic crisis is that many people have the impression that, especially in the US, that they are forgotten, that no one's taking care of them, that only the wealthy and very wealthy are being taken care of with tax rebates. And well, Biden is doing the right thing, improving the economy. And by doing that, he's trying to find cohesion. The role of the US in the world will depend upon this, whether he can find a middle ground consensus. I'm an optimist. What we see today is the effect of the COVID-19 crisis. And that poses a chance, an opportunity for us. Neoliberal ideas find no room in the world, no matter where we look at. We might say that the state is back. That is, people understand the importance of the state and state institutions, and people understand what happens when the government is not working. That will have major consequences. We can use that. We can use it.
Quando se falou
when it comes to the necessity for certain extra legal principles that need to be observed by political players, i.e. seeing political opponents as competitors rather than enemies, restraint in the sense of not trying to tilt the level playing field, even if you legally can. And in their book, and what you were describing as well in the slide with the numbers for 2010, is that the US might be on a slippery slope to undermining these guardrails ever more. What can be done to increase respect for those guardrails among political players?
That was a question for me. Is that right? Yes, thank you. Yes, well, that is the key. I think that the low-hanging fruit, by which expression I mean the easier tasks to accomplish, should be strengthening these guardrails, the free and fair elections, the rule of law, legitimacy of the opposition, and integrity of rights. And even that is proving challenging in the United States. It's really striking to me. I mean, the last time we had a real threat to democracy in the United States was in Watergate in the 1970s. And after that, Democrats and Republicans came together to try to strengthen the guardrails. But that was a time when we had low political polarization. And now that polarization is very high, it's much more difficult to do this. And as we're seeing, since January, the Republicans are trying to restrict voting rights in many states. Democrats are promoting a law through the US Congress to strengthen voting rights. And, the challenge in the US Congress, of course, is not the House of Representatives, which is run by majority rule, but rather the US Senate, where you have 100 senators, but for most legislation, you need 60 of them to agree to bring it to the floor for a vote. So you need a supermajority. There are 50 Democrats right now and 50 Republicans. It's evenly divided. The vice president casts the deciding vote if it's a tie. But that means that most legislation is not going to come forward to a vote in the Senate, including this voting rights legislation. So this is the huge hurdle. The effort of the Biden administration to enact some of this economic legislation that I was talking about can be possible through special procedures called reconciliation that can pass on 51 votes, but you can't do that for voting rights. So the question for the Democrats is whether they should override this filibuster rule and get rid of it. It's not part of the Constitution. It's simply something that has existed for a long time. Now it's actually interfering with democracy itself. And so many scholars think it is time to get rid of the filibuster because we think that the future of the country is endangered if some of these pillars of democracy, these guardrails, are not strengthened. And so it's utterly essential.
Marco, would you like to ask the next question? I fear the microphone is off.
Ele está com o microfone desligado.
Your microphone is still off.
Por favor, ative o seu microfone.
I will address all the panelists right now. Eu vou falar. Okay, so I will speak Portuguese. I think it's better. A questão que o que nós temos estudado, por exemplo.
What we have studied in a very interesting fashion is the debate on democracy and the polarized debate of several spectra of social relations, economy, politics, identity issues in the social media. And a short while ago, we saw Pluribus. Pluribus is a network of the extreme right wing, and our research was focused on how much the discourse of Pluribus, which is a right wing American network, how it is reflected in other countries. Of course, we were more interested in Brazil, and it was surprising to see how much the populist right in Brazil was copying the narrative of the US right wing. So my question to all of you is basically the following. There is an international movement among the right wing to disseminate their version and their perspective, to bring misinformation and to attack several democratic countries. Wouldn't it be important to strengthen the democratic clause in all foreign relations, as important as it is, for example, to include the environment today? I see a great need for democracies to get together and strengthen themselves mutually and see this as a necessary condition for any other solution or international cooperation to occur. So at least in the OCDE and in the G20, this should be very much reinforced and emphasized.
Also aus meiner Sicht haben wir eine Phase global, in der wichtige Mächte, Weltmächte, vorneweg die USA,
Well, in my opinion, we have a global phase in which we have the superpowers, first of all, the United States, who entered through the populist right wing. Then we have Russia, Putin's Russia. That doesn't remind us of the Soviet Union, but the authoritarian regime of the czars, the Sacred Alliance. It is also a strong factor regarding the support of different parties, extreme right-wing parties, or, as has been mentioned, the support of Marie Le Pen, or what we have from the AfD, extreme right-wing party in Germany. And the predominant issue is China. China as a new superpower, beginning to overcome and surpass the United States. But there, what we have is a dictatorial, authoritarian regime. And if you allow me to say it in a very straightforward way, with the election of President Bolsonaro in Brazil, Brazil also lost some of its role in the world. Here I'm trying to be diplomatic. I was Minister of Foreign Relations, and at the time, Brazil played a role of leadership in Latin America. It was a strong leadership when we looked at Brazil from abroad, and Brazil lost that. So we are looking at a time in which great superpowers all over the world are finding other ways. They are following the nationalist and populistic movements. That is why the election of Biden is so important. I would not dare even think what would have happened if Trump had been re-elected. It would have been a nightmare for all of us who are sitting here together, and especially for our American friends. And considering all that, I believe we should make all effort necessary to have this rollback of the right wing. It is possible. The pandemic offers us that opportunity because so many people are now convinced that they do need a government that is sensible, where institutions make sense, and where extreme right-wing party and politics makes no sense.
Ministro Tarso Genro, wollen Sie auch noch was dazu sagen?
I believe that the question was also asked to the other two panelists, Tarso Genro and Professor Suzanne Mettler. I believe in the beginning of our meeting, I have supported this idea, and I have done that in my party and in my political relations in the central left and central contexts. Foreign relations will be essential in the next few years. And of course, the filter for that is something that comes from top bottom. And it starts with the great economic power, so that vertically, on a top-down approach, with the countries they're interested in, it will happen. But then another type of game and relationship begins as we have polarizations, diverse polarizations, the center of power, political, economic, worldwide, which also has convergent and divergent interests, is up to countries like Brazil and intermediary countries. It is up to these countries to build bloc relationships, transparent, seamless, sincere, and honest relations with an agenda that has common interests, so that although the world is not good today, so that it can contaminate the countries that are at the same level. And then we'll have a world order, which is controversial, with conflicts, fragments, and different perspectives, but something which will fit in with all those things that are essential for the survival of human beings. So environmental sustainability and the pandemic, the mandatory neighborhood, that Kant mentioned, was never so alive and was never so concrete as it is today. And we need to remove from these tragedies. We need to get lessons learned from them. I am not a pessimist here, but I do believe that Biden's election was a key event to allow us to articulate a new order of peace and international exchange. Of course, we will face conflicts. It's not part of the nature of human beings, but at a level that is sustainable, that allows us to leave those situations not through slavery and destruction of other human beings, not through dictatorship, but rather through democratic relations in a minimally harmonic way.
Yes, I very much agree with everything that's been said. It was extremely disturbing during the Trump administration to see the President of the United States in this era cozying up to dictators around the world and seeming to have much more respect for Vladimir Putin than he had for leaders of democracies, including long-term allies of the United States. And it was an about-face of 180-degree difference from, in most ways, from President Obama before him. And I think that President Biden is going to try very hard in his foreign policy to be reinforcing the strength of democracy and our respect for democracies, and that being the guiding principle of American foreign policy. I think it's very important to him, and that he sees that quite clearly. So I feel hopeful about that. What I feel less hopeful about is the future of democracy in the United States. I think that it's tough sledding ahead, that we are going to continue to see a lot of possibility of real chaos going forward, because this political polarization is not dissipating quickly. And the pandemic has done much less than I would have guessed to bring people together, to bring Americans together. I might have guessed that a crisis of this scope would overcome polarization, but it has not. In fact, the very act of wearing a mask, for example, is very polarized. And there are many Americans who are unwilling to get a vaccine. Here we are so fortunate in the United States that vaccines are now readily available, but many people will refuse to get them really because of politics, which is, it is an indicator of how deep this polarization runs. And a lot of it has to do with fundamentalist Christianity, with religion, which has become aligned with the Republican Party in ways that are, I think, really dangerous. So I think that I agree, we need to work in foreign policy to try to create stronger alliances between democracies around the world to stand up for democracy. But those of us in the United States really have our work cut out for us to try to protect democracy here at home.
Daran anschließend passt eine weitere Frage aus dem Publikum an Minister Fischer, und zwar: Deutschland hat früher die EU zusammengehalten, indem es sich oft für die Stimme der kleinen Länder eingesetzt hat. Wie bewerten Sie die Rolle Deutschlands in Europa in den letzten Jahren?
Now, there's another question. Germany has maintained the cohesion, defending the voice of small countries. How do you assess the role of Germany in the last few years? Well, actually, that has not changed much. Problems are not problems amongst small or large countries. The problem with Hungary is not of that nature. And the issue is that Hungary, in a conscious way, has left a pillar or wants to leave this pillar, which is European Union. It wants to put an end to fair, free elections. That is a problem. And he likes resources, although though from the European Union on one hand, but on the other, he is defending a liberal democracy. So actually, what he's doing is propaganda against the European Union. But he's still interested on the financial resources coming from the European Union, so he's still acting and active in Brussels. I'd like to go back to what Professor Suzanne Mettler said. When did consensus in the United States come to an end? During the Cold War, there was a consensus. From the European point of view, it didn't matter whether we had a Republican or a Democrat in the White House. There was a common position, which was irrespective of party affiliation. That was it. But with the end of the Cold War, with the end of the Soviet Union, that came to an end, I believe. That's when this unipolar moment began domestically. And the consequences of domestic policy into foreign policy since Reagan, I believe, and Thatcher in the UK, that's when we had the neoliberal path being built. Fiscal tax reforms, which were benefiting only the rich and the very rich. And so the balance so harshly conquered, and the war was destroyed in the USA. That's my impression. And I believe Biden is now going on the right track. From the social and economic point of view, he is creating a new United States. I have no illusions. After 4 years of Trump government, he was still getting votes of 70 million Americans. That's a lot of votes. Even if he's no longer a candidate, his ideas are still there. They're alive in the Republican Party. So it depends on us whether we will do our homework right in the foreign security policy, but also in other areas. We need to take more responsibility over those things. This is what's happening in Europe.
Otherwise, Marco, would you like to ask one of them?
Para mim a pergunta, eu acho que
I believe the problem that countries like, and here I'm going to refer to Brazil, but the issue that faced by these countries is not explained only by objective issues. Of course, objective problems are very deterministic: inequality, asymmetry of opportunities. But there are other factors today which affect the situation in Brazil. In Brazil, I believe there is this feeling of being displaced or out of place, rather, which is quite emotional. People see themselves without job opportunities. Globalization is unclear and it's dealt with as an enemy. Jobs are flying to other countries, and access was also asymmetric. During the pandemic in Brazil, we had major issues regarding education. Children in public schools do not have equal access to digital means as children in private schools in those contexts that are richer and more sophisticated. And that increases the divide in our society, which is already so unequal. So when we look at this discourse of hatred, which simplifies life, pointing out towards enemies, where everyone who's central on the center or at the left wing are enemies, and where characteristics are determined by public policies, and where the government did decrease inequalities, everything is being criticized. And it's a contradiction with the pandemic now. Minister George Fischer mentioned that. It is quite clear. That is quite clear. What we see is the need to have the state, a stronger state, coming back. But what kind of state is that? People have mentioned and were distrustful of the state, but they want to rebuild the state. So what is the state? What is democracy in the 21st century? What is it going to deliver to the citizen? Because also the issue of the web and democratic polarizations, these things have to be clear. What are the challenges? There needs to be meaning behind that. What about the environment? The environment in Brazil should be dealt with in a different way, whereas it's dealt with in terms of the preservation of the Amazon. Okay, it is important. But what about the cities? Someone who spends hours inside a bus every day, how can they worry about the Amazon? They're commuting and they need to understand that green economy is benefiting the country and the environment all over the world. And how's that going to show a feedback to them? But this is all based on the preservation of democracy. The attack to democracy is very clear today. And the democratic field needs to think about how it can respond, not only in its logic rationale of potential actions, but why is democracy important as a human and humanistic factor? That is important. And President Biden, during the election campaign, and Professor Mettler might say that better than I do, he brought in the emotional issues that form the American democracy since the Declaration of Independence. That's important here in Brazil too. Social advances that were obtained after the military dictatorship was overthrown need to be revalued. Our society needs to find narratives that are not just logic, but which are based on our values, overarching values. That's the impression I get. And I would like to hear Professor Mettler on that.
Yeah, I very much like all of the questions that you're putting on the table there. When Americans are asked, when they were asked as recently as a few years ago in public opinion polls, whether they valued all of these pillars of democracy, these guardrails of democracy, people would say yes. People of either party would say yes. But as polarization has grown, Republicans are now less likely to say yes to all of those things, less likely to affirm those basic principles of democracy. And so, you know, that's really problematic. And I do think that in the United States, you know, we were able to be complacent for a long time about democracy and to not really think about it, to not really think about the importance of those guardrails, but to take them for granted. And I think that, you know, certainly Biden is talking about them a lot. I think that we need to, as a nation, think about them a lot more. I mean, the basic agreement that people need to have in a big, diverse society like the United States is that we're going to have competition between political parties, and you have to agree before the election that you're going to respect the result. And if the other guy wins, that you will then wait for the next election and run again, but you don't insist that you actually won. And when you lose that, you've lost democracy. And I'm stunned at the number of Americans who seem to have deviated from that principle right now. So I think we need to work really hard to rebuild a democratic culture in the United States, something that, you know, Americans long thought was really part of the fabric of our lives, but I think was not as deep as we thought. And I do agree that there are many Americans who feel displaced, and it is emotional. And, you know, that's very interesting to me. So in the United States, the Democratic Party is very much an urban party, and the Republican Party a rural party. And there are a lot of people in rural areas who feel like they've been left behind because while the economy has changed and industry has gone away, cities have found ways to adopt, and there are new jobs in cities for people. They're not as good paying for people with less education as the jobs of some decades ago, but there are jobs, whereas there are very few new jobs in rural areas. And those are the areas that are supporting politicians who seem to be less tied to the principles of democracy. But that's where I think that some of Biden's plans are very important to do things that can try to help rural people as well as urban people, to try to reinforce the idea that we're all together in this, and that government can do things that are helpful to everyone, regardless of where you live, regardless of who you are. So, you know, I hope that we can try to find that way forward.
Ich hätte noch eine Frage an Ministro Genro vom Publikum. Und zwar, wenn Sie auf die Lula-Jahre und Ihre Ministerzeiten zurückblicken, hätte man irgendetwas damals anders machen können?
Another question for Minister Genro, considering the Lula administration and Brazil today, please. I believe that the polarization we see today did not come with President Lula's administration. It was a result of the crisis faced by the Dilma Rousseff administration and global changes that occurred with extreme right-wing groups that formed networks and created these situations. You have brains scattered throughout the world. We don't know exactly who they are, which simply decided on the Brazilian crisis, because President Dilma Rousseff's government had a support which was very similar to that of President Lula. Here in Brazil, there was no administration with at least some political stability that did not rule with alliances with the regional oligarchies. These regional oligarchies have claims of their own that are legitimate, some of them, and they have claims that are not at all legitimate, that are very sordid, to restore even a certain kind of slavery in the north of the country, especially, and to revoke environmental laws and legislation, and also to bring down labor protection for this kind of labor. So this is Brazil. You have Brazil in the backdrop, you have the Brazil that's intermediate, and you have Brazil in the front line. Very difficult to govern all that. So when President Dilma Rousseff adhered to her opponent's agenda, she released that political forces that were around the government to go in whatever direction was more convenient for them within the context that we had. And the result of this process were actually two candidates that were positioned as if they were seeking a polarization. This work was done by the major media of this oligopoly in Brazil, which opposed Haddad to Bolsonaro. So we can never say, and I am also not affirming this, that something could not be done or that everything was right. Many things were wrong, of course, and I believe that together the Lula administrations did bring about a change in Brazil, making it a more democratic structure. We had dialogue in the society as we never had in Brazil. We had over 50 conferences in which society mobilized itself from the bottom up. We had a concept of social economic development that brought to the same environment, and I organized this council in the first years of his administration, when we had around the same table bankers, large landowners, landless movements, education movements, and they all together produced very important reforms in the country. From that group, we had the idea that came later on of the ProUni educational program that brought millions of poor and marginalized youth in the country's best universities. So it was a democratic revolution, a social democratic revolution that occurred in Brazil. Maybe for the European nations that already have this tradition, it doesn't mean so much. But for Brazil, which has slavist oligarchies and this tradition of authority based on money, was very important. And it really led some groups to feel threatened and very unhappy in their territory. In July 2013, we had fathers with their children carrying posters saying, "Out Dilma, I want a cheaper dollar because I want to go to Disney World." Another poster said, "No communism, Lula is a communist, Lula has to go to prison." This is outrageous. Lula was never even close to communism. He was never close to any communist movement, as I myself was earlier, and many of us were. But we were all framed within the contemporary democratic project led by President Lula in this new phase when the Brazilian left wing finally got organized. So it was an outrageous situation, and we lost all sense of this collective life. And there were many scenes, and a documentary will certainly be produced, where you have middle-class families in Copacabana here in Rio hitting on children who were stealing food. And handing them over to the police. Most of these children were Black and poor, of course. So things are going on in Brazil. I am a 74-year-old, but I am a militant and an activist. And I never had any expectation, any hopes that my country would go through this, that we would see so much hatred, not even during the military dictatorship. We didn't have so much hatred during the military governments as we have now. We had, of course, repression against those that were clandestine and that started movements, but it was not as disseminated and violent as it is now. And this has a name. We know how this is built. Fortunately, they have this is already wearing out, and it can help us to change the scenario for the next elections. So maybe something could have been done and was not done, but Lula's administrations were the best administrations in Brazil's Republican history. And this is also acknowledged by our opponents. And now you have 3 governments that were also very important: President Fernando Henrique, President Itamar Franco, and President Lula. They were the governments that were less disorganized and disastrous, and that had the greatest power to improve the nation.
Letzte Frage an Herrn Minister Fischer stellen und dann
Well, time unfortunately is running out, and I would like to ask a last question to Minister Fischer, and then you all 3 will have a chance for their last comments. The study of democracy was an object of research. Later on, the competencies of the parliament were expanded, and now it seems that the central forces are even more stronger than in the turn of the century. What would you recommend to improve the situation again? I have said several times that the implementation of the recovery programs will be of the essence. I think this is the most important thing. It is what will determine the success of the European Union and the United States. If it is possible, then I am an optimist. I think it will happen more slowly than we expect. It will be more difficult. We will have several setbacks, but it will happen. But if it does not happen, if it is not possible, then we will have a problem. This can be an enormous setback, but I am an optimist. We will have elections in Germany in a short while. Let us hope that they will bring a good result, and things are advancing. The European Parliament, with all its problems, is an institution that is much stronger than we can imagine. But things will not happen suddenly. The European Union, this group of countries, is a very complex process, but the alternative for the European state is something that is not possible.
Now perhaps you've got the chance to say some final word.
Yes, I very much agree with everything that Mr. Fischer was just saying. I think the best hope right now is that dealing with the pandemic and responding to the economic fallout of the pandemic does provide a way for government to be responsive to people and hopefully to convince some who've become very skeptical about government and willing to take risks to, burn it all down, is the expression one might use, to again have faith in government and to elect leaders who are responsible and willing to protect democracy. So that's my hope going forward.
Und Ministro Genro, möchten Sie noch ein Schlusswort halten?
Minister Genro, what do you think? I was called actually right now to see a document that is being launched by the indigenous populations here in Brazil because of the true persecutions that are going on against these communities on the part of the government. This is a strategic reflection for our future. We are reaching a point in which the humanism that inspires our constitution and also our international relations in Brazil, which even during the military government had sovereign positions, and that this will make us reflect on our future, on the next steps. I appreciated this debate greatly. I think it's extraordinary to have this opportunity of having Minister Fischer, Professor Suzanne Mettler together so that we can reflect upon this jointly. Maybe, who knows, in the future, we may meet again in a new period of recovery of the country so that democracy does not succumb to violence, to xenophobia, to torturers who are also present around the world. Thank you very much for the invitation. I am very proud to have shared these moments with you.
Marco, vielleicht noch?
Não, eu só basicamente.
By Marco Rudiger. I would like to thank for the German embassy for their generous invitation, and Ambassador Heiko Toms, Michael Westland, and also for the presence that is an honor to us, Minister Fischer, Minister Genro, Professor Suzanne Mettler. I think that there is some consensus that it is important to acknowledge that democracies are under attack, that societies are extremely polarized, and this is not happening only in Brazil, in the United States, or in Europe. This is happening in many democratic countries around the world, and we have great challenges to solve in the world with climate change, and this is interesting for all of us to resolve jointly with the United States, with Europe, with other countries. And we also see the expansion of the power of social media, which have an important capability of expanding and reflecting public cultural issues, but which also in the same time brings the problem of credible information. We have to pay close attention to that. And all these issues point towards challenges for democracy. And this will not be resolved alone by one single country, but rather by a group of countries that share common values. I believe that the problem in our world today is defending these values that characterize and define us as democratic countries, countries that have the rule of law and that adopt values that are distinct from the hate groups that we have in our countries, and also distinct from other countries which many times use social media to attack our democracies. So this consensus is very important, but it needs to be put to practice. So the foreign relations between our countries and understanding these cross-cutting problems need to follow the democratic values as a basic rule for dialogue. And this is very important because it is a problem that impacts all of us, and it must be addressed by all of us together, as must the climate change problem, for example. And therefore, I would like to thank the German embassy once more. We have been carrying out important research together with the support of the German government. I am very grateful for that. And I am here with two countries that are dear to me. I lived and studied in the United States. My relationship with Germany is also close. My family actually comes from Germany. Their academia is so strong. So I am very grateful. Thank you.
Dann verbleibt mir noch zum Schluss allen Rednern zu danken und zu erwähnen, das war heute das
We would like to thank all the speakers and say that this was Democracy Forum number 45. We began organizing these fora since 2018, and we are following the populist wave around the world. This was one of the first events in which we felt a little bit more optimism. This phenomenon is increasingly being studied and understood, which is cooperation. So we have the bubble of extremists, but we also have a growing group of people who are pro-democracy. And we hope that we can have a new chance of having efficient governance with democracy, that we know that this is very good for all of us and healthy. And we would like to announce the next two forums that we will hold around environmental issues. So we want to invite Brazil and the other countries. Thank you for the discussion and for your participation. We'll see you next time. And thanks for those who organized and contributed.